What's up, guys? Welcome back to The Collision. Daniel here to talk about at least one of my personally, most anticipated films of the year, Gladiator 2. Will it get the Emperor's thumb up or thumb down? I have seen it, so let's talk about it. So there was always like a degree of irony with Ridley Scott's original Gladiator film back in 2000, as audiences were asked to feel the grim horror, the dehumanizing spectacle of death in the Roman Colosseum, while simultaneously cheering in the movie theater with mouths stuffed full of popcorn, as the film delivered plenty of just bloody carnage for our amusement. But kind of in the middle of that tension was a very masterfully crafted and just compelling human drama. And now, kind of following on the heels of just the failure of Napoleon film last year, director Ridley Scott, who arguably is Hollywood's sort of master of historical epics, is returning to the well of one of his greatest hits. And I think to somewhat mixed results. I think Gladiator 2, it's an entertaining sequel that does go bigger, but not necessarily better. I think it provides plenty of fun and violent spectacle for audiences, but just little of the emotional depth that made the original movie so great. And I mentioned the film Napoleon because I think in many ways Gladiator 2 feels very much like a reaction to the very icy audience reception of that film. Kind of whereas that film, largely subverted expectations by just demystifying its subject as, a legendary war general into a mere pathetic domestic failure. Gladiator 2 is almost relentless in its attempt to, kind of give the rambunctious mob exactly what they want. And almost after each new elaborate visual spectacle flashes across the screen, I half expected to see Ridley Scott appear in camera himself to ask, "Are you not entertained?" Because this sequel is bigger really in every way to the original film. I think both in terms of just its overall narrative scope and just the elaborateness of the set pieces themselves. And due to the rapid technological advancement that we've had in the last 24 years since the original film, Ridley Scott just has more tools available to him now to put on a more elaborate show in the Colosseum. And that's as a viewer, we are treated to grand naval combat as sharks, swarm the waters below, or a battle between men and a large troop of baboons, and even one combatant who rides into the arena standing on the back of a rhinoceros. I think sort of the action is pedal to the metal, kind of over the top fun, even if it does sort of cross over the line into campiness, I think with some reckless abandon in ways that the more grounded original just seldom did. And yet, despite just the base level entertainment provided by the supersized spectacle, there's just a shallowness to the whole affair. I think kind of to start, despite the amped up visuals, the special effects themselves are mostly unimpressive. I think with the digitally created animals being particularly unconvincing. It never looks like a real rhinoceros or real baboon, just clearly just digital creatures. And kind of as a result, there's just this sort of almost an artificial gloss to the visuals that does keep the film from achieving sort of the gritty, tactile believability that it seems to be striving for. The bigger issue, though, to me, I think are the characters that are thrust into the middle of that spectacle. Although I will say that I think the issues derive more from the characterization rather than with the acting performances themselves. And obviously living up to the legacy of Russell Crowe, whose signature performance earned him an Academy Award for Best Actor in the original film, that is an impossible task. But I do think that Paul Mescal does give a very admirable effort. He just has a very impressive physical presence on screen. And I think also just showcases enough kind of haughty, arrogant confidence that does sort of differentiate himself from Russell Crowe's character. And the others too, Pedro Pascal and Joseph Quinn, I think also do well in limited roles. Although the clear standout, I think, is unquestionably Denzel Washington. He plays a man that just has very intriguingly murky allegiances and ambitions, and just brings scene-stealing energy whenever he appears on camera. If Gladiator 2 is destined to receive any real critical acclaim as its predecessor did, then I think Washington is the film's easy representative for awards consideration. But unfortunately, I think apart from Denzel Washington's character, the characters are just never as interesting as the actors who play them. I think Ridley Scott may have done well to take a cue from Washington's character in this movie as a gladiator leader to understand that violent spectacle really is only as compelling as the human drama at the center of it. For example, in one sequence, the Colosseum is flooded and two ships full of gladiators wage this epic battle, against each other. And it's just all very visually exciting. Except that the movie just hasn't given audiences really much reason to be emotionally invested in any of the combatants. Thinking of all the other gladiators that do surround Paul Mescal's character, remain largely anonymous and like interchangeable. And I think even, him in the central role just lacks intrigue. The film just seems to expect that audiences are going to root for him because, hey, he's the protagonist. That's what you do with movies, rather than providing like, much to earn that allegiance. The opening scenes do establish, I think, an important like human connection between him and his wife. But really, like once he becomes enslaved as a gladiator, he's largely just sort of reduced to this rage-filled warrior and kind of just like brought back on the screen just for action sequences. And I think his like somewhat shortchanged like character arc is perhaps also just a consequence of the overall expanded narrative scope in this movie. I think kind of whereas the original Gladiator was really mostly like a contained revenge story of one man, Gladiator 2 strives to tell like a more sweeping narrative just about Rome with increased political intrigue and subplots. I think just like the decision to rely more on like an ensemble cast rather than kind of narrowing its focus to sort of his own individual journey can just make the main A plot sometimes just feel like an afterthought. As far as content to consider, things going on the surface of this, for language, really not a whole lot here at all. I just counted 2, maybe 3, like, minor profanities. For violence, as should be expected for this movie, this is a violent movie that really doesn't hold back and just like the bloody carnage of the Colosseum. And thus we see several characters like decapitated, with one man like, having his head pretty gruesomely like cut off. And later that like severed head is, paraded around and put on display. And just, you see other, characters have limbs cut off or, they're hacked, slashed, stabbed, as blood forcefully spurts out of wounds. And I think in one like disturbing moment, a character sort of slowly presses a long, needle into another man's ear and into his skull. As for sexuality, I think reflective of like the historical Rome, many of like the privileged inhabitants, like particularly the men, are very like effeminate and seemingly like sexually fluid, appearing to be like equally attracted both to male and to female. Kind of like the more hedonistic emperors in this are frequently surrounded by both male and female like groupies or concubines in several scenes. There is like one conversation where a character remarks that a husband is more interested in other men than he is in his wife, to which like the listener declares that the same could be said of him at times as well. The only other kind of content stuff in this is there is like, traces of religion. The gods are evoked on several occasions. There's also like a repeated like dream-like sequence that depicts sort of the pagan afterlife as, the ferrymen are transporting deceased characters into the, the beyond. And like whether those scenes are intended to be taken literally or just as like a near-death hallucination is left ambiguous. And there's also a moment where a character is counseling the emperor not to use crucifixion as a mean to execute a very high-profile prisoner, saying that, that form of execution is reserved for lowlife and Christians. First themes, worldview, things going on beneath the surface. I think in many ways, Gladiator 2 is just all about power, who truly has it and what does it take to obtain it. Each of the major players in the story are striving for power and kind of each believes that they have the upper hand. You have the twin emperors who, claim power just due to their, their right, their lofty titles and position. The general, who's Pedro Pascal's character, wields like the power of armies. And then Denzel Washington's character kind of attempts to claim authority by more like manipulating the will of the people. And at various times, characters do give like lip service to the gods, but they are clearly driven by their own like human ambition. And kind of in that way, the Rome of Gladiator 2 is a very starkly like Darwinian world where the strongest survive by preying upon the weak. And really all that truly matters is like who ends up on top, regardless of like the death and destruction required to get there. And kind of like against the backdrop of that very bleak world is a debate between like idealism and realism. There's sort of like frequent talk about like the dream of Rome, which is for it to be a place where men and women are free of tyranny, but kind of like at the title cards of this movie declares that like, in the 16 years since the original film, like that dream is all but dead and forgotten. There's a man that sort of notes, with a lot of cynicism that, that dream was a fragile thing that really could only be spoken of in a whisper lest it crumble. And like as a result, there is this like constant tension between like the way that things should be and the way that things truly are. And even like one of the more like ambitious power players in the movie chides another that, she lives in the world of like idealistic dreams, where he lives in the real world of like power and violence. And obviously, like the America of today is not the Rome of the first century, but I do think like these themes continue to echo into our present circumstances. I think kind of the debate between idealism and realism is very relevant just to much of like the culture war rhetoric, kind of whether people should continue to hold on to a seemingly unobtainable ideal, or if a more like realist, pragmatic mentality is required that like, plays the game by the established rules, no matter how much it costs, in order to obtain victory and cultural power. But as we know, just from Scripture, Jesus declared to his disciples that the world would know them, that they are his followers, if they have love for one another, and preached a very like countercultural, turn the other cheek, approach that was a stark contrast to the violent, kind of power grabbing world around him. Thinking of all throughout Scripture, Christians are called to strive for the ideal of, Christ's kingdom, even if it's an unattainable one in our lifetime, rather than like, adopt, the mindsets of the unbelieving world. Thinking of rather than just sort of give lip service to the gods, only to be driven by human ambition, Christians can take heart that like, vengeance does belong to God alone. So in the end, I like this movie for the most part. I think Gladiator 2 is not without merit or any entertainment value, even if it does lack the depth that made, the original earn such a lofty reputation. I think the sequel almost like unavoidably does invite comparisons to the original by, essentially following the very same narrative template as that first film, which may leave audiences, with the feeling that they've seen this all before, only done better. Perhaps merely it's the carnal human lust for violence that, remains centuries after the Roman Colosseum closed for business. But I do think like Gladiator 2 is this still an enjoyable experience. I think honestly, just a legendary director providing a sweeping spectacle-filled, historical epic is just what cinema is all about. In the original Gladiator film, Maximus famously said, what we do today echoes in eternity. And I think nothing in Gladiator 2 seems destined to echo very far into the future. But if only for two, blood-soaked hours in the Colosseum, I do think it provides enough just to keep audiences entertained. But hey, would love to hear what you think. If you, were amped up for this movie, or, hey, maybe you haven't even seen the first movie, don't be shy. Jump into the comment section. Let's have a conversation about it. If you haven't done so too, encourage you guys, subscribe to the channel, become a Collider. There's lots of other movie reviews and got our Faith and Pop Culture podcast and interviews, just other fun stuff. Would love to have you be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thank you for watching. Stay safe and continue to collide with your love for Christ.